Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either an interview with a guest or multiple guests, or a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education. In this episode, I'm going to be unpacking a paper that Leanne DeLyzer actually recommended in the previous interview that you may have listened to last week. So this paper is titled Culturally Responsive School Leadership, a Synthesis of the Literature, and is by Mohammed A. Khalifa, Mark Anthony Gooden, and James Earl Davis. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. All right, here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, Culturally responsive school leadership, CRSL, has become important to research on culturally responsive education, reform, and social justice education. This comprehensive review provides a framework for the expanding body of literature that seeks to make not only teaching, but rather the entire school environment responsive to the schooling needs of minoritized students. Based on the literature, we frame the discussion around clarifying strands: critical self-awareness, CRSL and teacher preparation, CRSL and school environments, and CRSL in community advocacy. We then outline specific CRSL behaviors that center inclusion, equity, advocacy, and social justice in the school. Pulling from literature on leadership, social justice, culturally relevant schooling, and students or communities of color, we describe 5 specific expressions of CRSL found in unique communities. Finally, we reflect on the continued promise and implications of CRSL. End quote. Right, if I were to summarize this article into a single sentence, I'd say that the article summarizes and synthesizes literature on culturally responsive school leadership as it relates to principals in urban schools. Now, even though this particular article is talking about principals in urban schools, I will try my best to relate it to computer science educators, because I believe that many of us are actually leaders, even if we are not the head of an organization or not in, the board for CSTA or something like that. You might likely be the only person on your campus who is doing computer science education, which means you are a leader within that specific context. And by the way, you can actually read the full article, which I highly recommend doing, by simply going to my website, which is jaredoleary.com, or by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on to go directly to the show notes. Underneath the article section, you just simply click on the title and you'll be able to go to a PDF of the article, which is provided on the Google Scholar profiles of the authors. Which, by the way, if you click on the author last names, it'll take you to their profiles, so you can actually read some more publications by each of the authors. In addition to the links related to this article, there's also hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources for computer science educators, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I work for, and I create 100% free coding curriculum that might be of interest to you. All right, so in the introduction of this particular article, that kind of unpacks some of these seminal works that have led to these discussions, such as Gloria Ladson-Billings, who I did a podcast episode on their seminal work, or Geneva Gay, who talks specifically about culturally responsive education, whereas Ladson-Billings talks about culturally relevant, and then Paris, who talks about culturally sustaining pedagogies. Now, why this is important is because the authors are saying that while this is very important to focus on, it is not the only thing that needs to happen in order to improve the lives of minoritized students inside and outside of schools. In fact, we can't just focus on the pedagogies, but we also need to focus on how to reform and transform, quote, all aspects of the educational enterprise, such as funding, policymaking, and administration, so they too are culturally responsive, end quote. That's from page 2 of the PDF. This is really important, and it's something that I've been sitting with for a while now, really thinking about, is like grant initiative and research projects, making sure that it actually improves the lives of the community. And where this came out of is through an interview that I did with Mitch Resnick, which will likely come out in the next couple of weeks. And one of the things that he mentions in that interview is wishing that researchers focused more on improving the lives of communities in which they do their research, rather than just proving whether or not a curriculum or PD works. So when looking at some future grants that I'm collaborating on, and by the way, I'm happy to collaborate with you if you're interested, just reach out to me. One of the things that we're really focusing on is how do we improve not just what happens in the classroom, but the school life in general. So specifically in relation to computer science education, how can we also improve access to devices, access to broadband technology, improvements in the structure of when computer science is implemented in schools, like how much time is allocated for it, where does this occur, etc., rather than just focusing on pedagogies or curriculum. Now, from a leadership standpoint, this is interesting because the authors point out that leaders need to not just focus on the pedagogies that are culturally responsive or sustaining or relevant, but also needs to sustain an environment that attracts teachers who teach in this way, and supports them in a way that makes them want to continue to teach at that school and to work in an environment with that approach. And in this particular study, they specifically focus on urban school leaders. However, these findings that I'm about to unpack are definitely relevant outside of that. All right, so here's a longer quote that I want to read that's from PDF page 4. And it's an important quote to consider and to kind of contextualize everything else that's I'm about to chat about. Quote, "Culturally responsive leaders develop and support the school staff and promote a climate that makes the whole school welcoming, inclusive, and accepting of minoritized students. Finally, we recognize that culturally responsive leadership is needed in all settings, including those not dominated by minoritized students, and that not all students of color are minoritized. In this article, we address culturally responsive leadership of minoritized students. Here, we consider minoritized students individuals from racially oppressed communities that have been marginalized, both legally and discursively, because of their non-dominant race, ethnicity, religion, language, or citizenship. Indeed, all minoritized students also have rich histories of agency, appropriation, and resistance to oppression. Yet, this term recognizes the histories of oppression minoritized students have faced and the need for schools to resist the continuing context of oppression. We further acknowledge that gender, sexuality, income, and other factors lead to even further marginalization. Because minoritized students have become disadvantaged by historically oppressive structures, and because educators and schools have been intentionally or unintentionally complicit in reproducing this oppression, culturally responsive school leaders have a principled, moral responsibility to counter this oppression." End quote. Now, if we replace the words like leaders or leadership with just like computer science educator, I think this still makes a lot of sense, which is why I'm glad that Leanne shared this with me, and which is why I wanted to read this on the podcast. A while back, I did an episode where I discussed a paper by the Kapor Center that discussed some survey findings from a national survey of CS educators, and I believe it was around 40% of educators did not think that we needed to discuss social justice issues in computer science education classes. I respectfully disagree with that, as I would argue that CS educators, who are typically leaders in the space in their schools that they are at, need to consider this. And so hopefully this framework will help you with being able to lead by example within your school, or whatever kind of context you're working in. All right, so that was kind of the intro of the paper. So the next section of this paper talks about the methods, so they kind of discuss their approach to reviewing literature. I'm going to skip this, but it is very well thought out in terms of what kind of terminology and key terms they are using, how they went about doing this. And as somebody who's done like discourse analysis, I read this and was like, yep, that's solid. So I have no complaints or criticisms about the approach that they used. But if you are interested in it, again, you can actually check it out for free, as the authors have linked to it on their Google Scholar profiles. One thing that I will kind of talk about that is on page 8 within this methods section is their discussion on essentially colonization or oppression that can occur in sometimes subtle ways. So for example, they cite some scholars that found, quote, that when African American students violated white middle class rules of interaction, such as speaking louder or questioning class rules or teacher authority, they were referred to the principal's office more often than white students. And despite there being no evidence for behavioral differences, Blacks and Latinos are more likely than whites to be referred to the office for such subjective offenses, such as defiance and noncompliance. These responses create a hostile school environment and lead to student disengagement in school, as frequent suspensions appear to significantly contribute to the risk of academic underperformance. End quote. It's from pages 8 and 9. In addition, they also cite some scholarship later on that says that the teacher expectations of minoritized students are often lower than white students. So these are some of the subtle or not so subtle ways that minoritized students might be oppressed within classrooms. When I was reading this, I was like, I really wish I had some kind of a data on like the demographic information of the students that I ended up sending to the office. It was usually few and far between. It's usually only when like a student hit another kid or something like that. So I tried to handle like any issues within house and try to make it like a space where kids can kind of calm down if they're just having a bad day. But I don't know like what was the different percentages of different demographics. And it's something as CS educators that I really think that we should consider and think about. Even when it's just like, who are you calling on in class? Like if you're asking a question and 5 students raise their hand to answer it, who do you pick and why? And if you were to repeat this and actually like track that data over time, is there a pattern that emerges in it? One of the things that I found in music classes, I tended to really focus on percussionists because I was a percussionist. And specifically, if I was working with a drum line, I'd focus on snare, which is the instrument that I marched. And when I started to reflect on how this is creating an imbalance in terms of feedback and instructional time and whatnot, I consciously made some efforts. Hey, I need to focus on the other instruments more. If we extrapolate that and apply it into a demographic setting in a CS class, it's, oh, I realize that I call on girls more than boys or non-binary students. Maybe I need to spread this out more evenly, or whatever it is. It could also be like, who are you asking to teach other students? So when you're engaging in peer-to-peer learning, do you send them to a specific demographic more than another? Now, I don't know, obviously, because it's your class, but it's just something that I think is worth considering. All right, so the next section that starts on PDF page 9 talks about some of the overview characteristics or behaviors that they found in the literature. So there are 4 major strands that emerge. So the first strand is on critical self-awareness. The second strand is on culturally responsive curricula and teacher preparation. The third strand is on culturally responsive and inclusive school environments. And then the fourth strand is on engaging students and parents in community contexts. So let's briefly unpack each one of these. Okay, so the first one, critical self-awareness. So this found that principals in urban schools really tended to focus on who they were, what their values were, what their beliefs and dispositions were, and how that impacted the students that they were working with, in particular the minoritized students. And the author suggests that this self-awareness serves as a foundation for how they impact and influence and work with and support the communities that they are serving in their schools, which to me makes a lot of sense. If you're viewing students or the communities that you work with from a deficit framework, that is going to have a significant negative impact compared to if you are approaching this from like a culturally relevant or responsive or sustaining mindset. So the second one, culturally responsive curricula and teacher preparation. So the authors mentioned that, at least at the time of this publication, many teachers did not have access to culturally responsive training or professional development, either while they were getting their degrees in education or through professional development through continuing education credits. So the authors argued that it is really kind of up to the leader to ensure that teachers not only have a background in it, but continue to engage in culturally responsive practices. It doesn't necessarily mean that the principal has to do like a weekly discussion on these practices, but they need to be able to support it in some kind of a way, acknowledge that there are some challenges involved with people not having enough experience with culturally responsive pedagogies, and then find some ways that they can address it and talk about it as a staff. So here's a quote from page 10. Quote, "This outcome can be achieved by recruiting and retaining culturally responsive teachers, securing culturally responsive resources and curriculum, mentoring and modeling culturally responsive teaching, or offering professional development around CRSL. After they have become more culturally responsive, leaders must be willing to guide teachers into having courageous conversations where they interrogate their assumptions about race and culture and their impact on the classroom. Research suggests leaders must develop strategies for developing teachers who are not and may not ever resist becoming culturally responsive. However, culturally responsive school leaders must also be willing to make the hard decision to counsel out those teachers who recognize this work is not for them." End quote from page 10. Yeah, and one thing that I guess I want to add to this is that that's hard to do at times. Like, it's difficult to voice some of these things publicly and to engage in some of these conversations, but we really need to do it. Which is one of the reasons why, like, I'm so open about here's my honest thought about this particular sensitive topic, whatever it may be, in the podcast that I'm sharing, and why I'm speaking publicly about it. Is I just wish we had more communication. Even if you disagree with me, which is totally cool, let's have a conversation. That, I think, would be really helpful. And which is why, like, I've invited a lot of people on this podcast who have published something that I have unpacked in one of these solo episodes. It certainly can be tricky having these conversations, especially because I don't know how what I'm saying is interpreted. So anyways, I hope that these podcasts kind of help spark some kind of a conversation either internally with yourself or with some colleagues that you have in your community. All right, so the third strand that's on here is the culturally responsive and inclusive school environments. So this is all about recruiting, retaining, and developing teachers, and then trying to find some resources that you can leverage to address some of the issues that might be occurring in the schools that you're working with. So for example, finding some resources to challenge like the issues that are going on with suspensions and how certain demographics might be unfairly targeted during those kind of suspensions or other punishments and whatnot. All right, and the fourth strand that they identified is on engaging students and parents in community contexts. And so that's kind of self-explanatory, but it's specifically doing this in a culturally relevant or appropriate way. Now, if we think of each one of these different strands, the four strands of critical self-awareness, culturally responsive curricula and teacher preparation, culturally responsive and inclusive school environments, and engaging students and parents in community contexts. These are all things that we as CS educators can do on our own. All right, so on pages 12 and 13, here's like a really good summary of some behaviors of culturally responsive school educators. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read off the different category or strand that I previously mentioned, and then I'm going to read the quotes from each one of the things that's in here. And then I'm going to dive deeper into this in the remaining pages of this particular paper, which I, again, highly recommend you read. All right, so under the first strand of a leader who critically self-reflects, here is what they mention. So a leader is, quote, committed to continuous learning of cultural knowledge and context, displays a critical consciousness on practice in and out of school, displays self-reflection, uses school data and indicants to measure CRSL, uses parents and community voices to measure culturally responsiveness in schools, challenges whiteness and hegemonic epistemologies in school, using equity audits to measure students' inclusiveness, policy, and practice, leading with courage, and is a transformative leader for social justice and inclusion, end quote. All right, so here is the characteristics or behaviors of a leader who develops culturally responsive teachers. So this kind of leader engages in, quote, developing teacher capacities for culturally responsive pedagogy, collaborative walkthroughs, creating culturally responsive PD opportunities for teachers, using school data to see cultural gaps in achievement, discipline, enrichment, and remedial services, creating a CRSL team that is charged with constantly finding new ways for teachers to be culturally responsive, engaging or reforming the school curriculum to become more culturally responsive, modeling culturally responsive teaching, and using culturally responsive assessment tools for students, end quote. Now, a leader who promotes culturally responsive, inclusive school environments is a leader who engages in, quote, accepting indigenized local identities, building relationships, reducing anxiety among students, modeling CRSL for students in building interactions, promoting a vision for an inclusive instructional and behavioral practice, if need be, challenging exclusionary policies, teachers, and behaviors, acknowledges values and uses indigenous cultural and social capital of students, uses student voice, using school data to discover and track disparities in academic and disciplinary trends, end quote. And then finally, the fourth strand, a leader who's engaging in this kind of behavior engages students, parents, in indigenous context, and they do it by, quote, developing meaningful, positive relationships with community, is a servant leader as public intellectual and other roles, finding overlapping spaces for school and community, serving as advocates and social activists for community-based causes in both the school and neighborhood community, uses the community as an informative space for which to develop positive understanding of students and families, resists deficit images of student and families, nurturing caring for others, sharing information, and connecting directly with students, end quote. All right, so that may have been hard to hear and really kind of see that through a podcast. So again, I highly recommend checking out this table, and it's on PDF pages 12 and 13 from the PDF that is on the author's Google Scholar profiles, which you can find at jaredoleary.com in the show notes. Okay, so let's dive deeper into this. So the critical self-reflection. So here's a quote that is actually a quote from somebody else. So this is from Dantley, but this is quoted on page 14. Quote, a psychology of critical self-reflection involves the education leader coming to grips with his or her own identity and juxtaposing that against the identity of the learning community. In this process, an individual leader is recognizing that she or he is a cultural being influenced by multidimensional aspects of cultural identity, even as she or he attempts to do the work of leadership. In the literature, such leaders are urged to examine their own biases and how they affect their professional practices, end quote. So that's a wonderful practice that I think educators could really engage in. Now, I'll include a link to this in the show notes, but if you haven't read the CSTA standards for teachers that have come out, I highly recommend check those out. So one of the whole things is to really focus on engaging in self-reflection. And in particular, I love that this is not just reflecting on your own identity, but juxtaposing it with the identities within the communities that you're working with. I think that is a wonderful idea and is something that we should all do as CS educators. One example that really stands out for me is in the very first school that I started teaching in when I taught general music and band is I had a kid who was talking about how when they go home, they were going to play this game that I was also playing. And I was like, wait a minute, you're in elementary school. That game is not appropriate for you. And they said that they could do it because their parents work 3 or 4 jobs every day. And so they almost literally never see their parents. So if I were to juxtapose my own childhood with that of that particular student, it's very different. And it's something that I need to consider. Oh, what worked for me is not necessarily going to work for this particular student. And if we expand that just beyond that single example, it wouldn't necessarily work for the hundreds of students that I was working with each week. in that particular school. All right, so there's a subsection in this self-reflection, and the subsection is on internalized racism and the normalization of white Western epistemologies. And I've actually talked about this a decent amount in some of the other podcast episodes. So if you haven't listened to the pedagogy of the oppressed episodes in particular, those kind of unpack the different epistemologies or ways of knowing or ways of being, ontologies, in relation to like axiologies, which are the values or ways of valuing. So I really recommend checking those out to kind of hear me talk about this a little bit more. But what they're basically saying is, hey, as educators, we really need to think about the ways in which we might be unintentionally colonizing ways of knowing or being in the communities that we are working in. And in particular, it's often through white Western ways of being. And so I recommend actually going through and reading this like 2 pages of information and then listening to the episodes or even reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And again, I'll include links to these in the show notes. All right, so the next section is on developing culturally responsive school teachers and curriculum. So building off of what I just mentioned, the teachers in the school and the pedagogies they use and the resources, like the curriculum that they use, will have a direct impact on the kinds of ways of knowing and being are encouraged or supported in a classroom and which ones are not. Now, what the authors recommend is that while some teachers may come into the classroom having a better understanding of culturally responsive and relevant and sustaining pedagogies, others will not. It is really up to the principal or the leaders on campus to help people get more comfortable engaging in these conversations and learning more about this. Now, as a CS educator, you might be a leader in the space, and you might, if you're working like, let's say with the CTE team at high school, which is career and technical education, or if you just happen to be integrating CS in your elementary class or wherever, highly recommend trying to find ways to get more comfortable with conversations around difficult topics in relation to education. And so hopefully these studies that are kind of summarized and synthesized in here and the synthesis itself is useful to you with starting and continuing those conversations, even when they get difficult. Sit with it. I believe it was the interview that I did with Joyce McCall, or maybe it was even the interview with Nikki Washington, which either way, I highly recommend listening to both of those. But at least one of them mentioned, hey, when it gets uncomfortable, don't leave the room. Sit with that uncomfortable feeling and continue the conversation. As difficult as it may be, do what you can to put yourself out there and continue the conversation on difficult topics. And the last subsection within this actually talks about culturally responsive leadership preparation programs. So if you are maybe a board member for CSTA or on some kind of a leadership capacity within computer science education, or maybe you're even a professor in higher education, find ways to engage in these conversations about being a leader in those spaces. And check out pages 17 and 18 for a little discussion on that. All right, so the next strand, promoting culturally responsive and inclusive school environments. So the authors argue that many of the publications they looked at had leaders who were advocating for the inclusion of traditionally marginalized students. And that in order to do this, leaders needed to be critically self-aware and knowledgeable of like the racism and the histories of oppression that were likely occurring in the school itself and in the community, and how they could try and reduce that racism and other forms of systemic oppression that might occur. Now, the authors mention that the school leaders also tended to have like positive psychology characteristics or traits. So for example, engaging in growth mindset or like grit, etc. It was interesting reading this because I also happened to be reading another publication for an upcoming interview. And the author in that publication actually mentions that growth and grit mindset might actually be detrimental in that it is encouraging people to work within systems of oppression rather than challenging these systems of oppression. And I thought that was a really interesting point, and hopefully I'll be able to talk about that more later with that particular interview. So giving you a teaser for an interview that probably won't come out for another month or two. All right, so the last strand of engaging students in Indigenous community context. This is all about creating a welcoming space for students that demonstrates that you care not only about them and the communities that they're in, but also what they are learning. And from a leadership standpoint, there are many ways that you can do this. So for example, on page 20, mentions that leaders can engage in some of the following. Quote, time allocations were granted to teachers to allow them time to visit homes and other community-based locations. Similarly, cultural artifacts, curricula, space for community members, and partnerships and other resources were all leveraged in ways that responded to student needs, end quote. So those are some examples of how you can do that. Now, the next subsection in this specifically talks about social and cultural capital of students. But I again talk about this much more in some of the other podcasts that I've already mentioned, like Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and even like the discussion with Joyce McCall. So I really recommend listening to that. Like Joyce is way more of an expert on that than I am. And again, I include the link to that in the show notes. All right, so the next section on page 21. So this actually basically provides some vignettes of of culturally responsive leaders in different communities. So they have a discussion on Latino families and strong family bonds. They have a discussion on indigenous leadership practices that focuses on tradition. They have a discussion on Blacks and advocacy of community-based issues. And then they have a discussion on leadership in the post-colonial context. And then they also have a discussion on going between criticality and spirituality, prophetic traditions of leadership. Those were basically the subsection titles for the next few pages of those vignettes. All right, so then the paper concludes with just kind of a discussion that kind of recaps what's going on, and then says that, hey, if you want to engage in this, you really need to find some ways to overlap both the school and community spaces. So if it's going to be culturally relevant, it needs to have input from everybody. We need to all be able to learn from each other. It can't be one direction, top down, or anything like that. All right, so that's kind of an overall summary of this particular article. I hope it serves as a teaser to encourage you to want to actually read it, which again, you can find for free. Now, at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I'd just like to share some lingering questions or thoughts that I have. So one of them is kind of a framing of, in what ways are you a leader in CS education? Even if you're not on a board for like CSTA, or you're not developing standards for your state or something like that, how are you still providing a leadership role, even if it's just with your students, in computer science education? Once you think about that in relation to your students, how are you providing a leadership role on your campus or in your school or in your organization? And in what ways can you expand that reach? So in asking a similar question with myself, that's how I ended up eventually joining CSTA's board in Arizona, where I'm the treasurer at the time of this recording. It was simply getting to know people and trying to figure out what are some other ways that I could help impact the field. I'll include a link in the show note to learn more about this, but I also recommend listening to the interview with Jason Bohr, who talks about how to kind of join and become a leader in your local CSTA chapter. Now, another question that I have is, how might you develop or improve your own culturally relevant or responsive or sustaining leadership style? So Leanne mentioned that this article was helpful for kind of framing some of the things that she's learning as a leader, and we talked a little bit about that in the episode that released last week. But this is just one of many articles that you could read on this particular topic. And the final question that I have at this point is, what surprised you about the categories of leadership in this article? Like, for example, what leadership approaches were not mentioned that you thought might have been mentioned? So what would you add if you were writing your own remix of this particular article or extension? I hope this podcast encourages you to continue to learn more about these different practices and then engage in discussions within the field on them. As uncomfortable as they might be, they are worth it. And if you ever want to engage in a discussion with myself on the podcast, or even just one-on-one, feel free to reach out. There's a contact me button on my website, especially if you disagree with something that I said. I'm happy to chat through that, and then we can learn from each other. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed this, I hope you consider sharing with somebody else. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.